Okay, welcome everybody to this penultimate panel session of On Helix 2021. And this time, I guess we focused a lot so far on some of the tools and we focused a bit on therapeutics. This panel is going to focus on diagnostics. So the diagnostic and in vitro diagnostics, I read, is forecast to become a $100 billion market by 2025. So in huge growth year on year. And I guess some of the things I'm left in my mind questioning, what's driving that? Is it uptake in different geographies and new markets? Is it new technologies coming through, an increase of changes in healthcare practice? Are the equipment we've got enable us to do more early diagnosis? And I guess that's what I'm reading a lot about, is earlier diagnosis is better in the sense that intervention has more impact in many situations. So I'm delighted we have a panel here today who specialize in this field and are able to shed some light maybe on some of those questions I have and any that come in from the audience. Do feed them through the chat box and they will make their way to me as moderator, and I'll try and work those to the panel as we go along. So without more from me, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves, about themselves and their organizations. And perhaps as part of that introduction, maybe give what do you think one of the key driver is of this explosion in vitro diagnostics. So I'm going to come first to Fiona.
Thanks, Tony. Hello, everyone. So I'm Fiona Marston, and apologies for my voice. It's just come back after a bout of laryngitis. And I have a background in infectious diseases, originally as a CEO of a small biotechs developing antibiotics and another developing vaccines. I'm currently entrepreneur in residence at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and I've worked for LSTM as an employee for the previous 3 years, supporting them with a small team on commercial engagement. And I did that across LSTM and the University of Liverpool. I guess here I can represent some of the things that we're doing within academia at LSTM. During the COVID crisis, we have a very strong diagnostics team at LSTM, which is led by Dr. Emily Adams, and they were very involved in assessing a number of the diagnostic tests, the in vitro diagnostic tests that came forward through obviously the response to the COVID pandemic. We also were involved in clinical trials, particularly for the AstraZeneca vaccine, but also more recently for the Moderna vaccine. And again, all of those diagnostic tests were handled by Emily's group. So we've had huge experience, but prior to that, and continuing obviously as we come out of lockdown, the School of Tropical Medicine has a lot of involvement in diagnostics relating to AMR. We have very strong links with the various NHS trusts in Liverpool. So we work very closely, for example, with academics working on sepsis, as well as on approaches to good stewardship for antibiotics and using diagnostic tests. So I would say that going forward, and based on my own background, the areas where commercially as well as overlapping into science I know best are some of the challenges to do with antibiotic use, as well as the challenges of developing tests for sepsis, which is a major problem. And separately, I'm a non-exec director for Alderhay NHS Foundation Trust in Liverpool, which is the Children's Hospital. So I have a good awareness now of the issues that are relating to get products into the NHS. As many of you may know, we're moving now rapidly to integrated care systems, which means that Alderhay is now part of a very big ICS, which spans across Cheshire and Merseyside. And I know that what they're moving towards for procurement is a combined procurement model. So what that means for them is that it's a very efficient model in terms of having a single point of contact. But for many of you who may be developing and wanting to sell diagnostics into the NHS, it gives you fewer points of contact, and I think raises challenges. And then finally, I'm also an advisor to a seed fund, UK I2S, the UK Innovation Science and Seed Fund. And so I can certainly comment on our attitude towards our portfolio of diagnostic companies and some of the challenges that companies face in raising money. So Tony, hopefully that's covered everything you'd like me to say.
Yep, that's perfect, Fiona. Thank you. I think some of those points we'll certainly come back to, I think, as we go through. Suppose I can go to Robert.
Hi, Tony. Thanks very much for inviting me. So I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Biofidelity. We are a small startup in the Cambridge area, and we are focused on oncology. So my background comes from both sort of academic and commercial sector. In oncology, I was involved in some companies in the early stages of next generation sequencing. And I was also most recently involved in bringing the radar assay through to commercial development at Innovata. So I joined Biofidelity actually in December last year. So I've been here for about 6 months. And what really attracted me to Biofidelity was the technology that the company has, which is very different from a lot of traditional oncology companies. So our founder, Barney Balforth, was previously at Base 4, which was a sort of a startup focused on developing novel next generation sequencing technologies. And Biofidelity was really spun out of there as using sort of some clever molecular biology that was invented around a particularly novel and not very widely understood chemistry called pyrophosphorylases, which is essentially the reversal of DNA polymerization. And this is exquisitely sensitive for single nucleotide variants and mismatches. And effectively what we're doing is we're commercializing that technology at the moment. And our first panel is, well, our first product really is aimed at non-small cell lung carcinoma. And we're aiming to commercialize that initially through the US market, first through a CAP clear laboratory, which we're opening in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina as a lab developed test. And then later on in the year through research use only kits, moving into IVDs later. So the challenges that we see out there at the moment in terms of adoption of tests for oncology are really around access. So even in the US, something like 50% of patients are not getting access to the types of diagnostics molecular diagnostics that they could usefully have that would help inform on their treatment decisions. And so our test really is significantly cheaper than next generation sequencing. It's also incredibly simple to apply. It requires only, I think, 4 different molecular biology steps, and it can be run on a qPCR instrument rather than a next-gen sequencing instrument as a readout. But equally, it's not qPCR, it's a very different technology. And so it allows us to build panels that have exquisite sensitivity for detection of actionable variants. And that's what we're seeking to work on at the moment. So in terms of contributions through this discussion, hopefully I can sort of talk to you a little bit about early detection in the oncology space. Obviously, there's some significant movement there with some of the companies in the US at the moment, for example, the Grails, the Thrives, the Exact Sciences, and Guardant Healths of this world. And perhaps I can talk to you a little bit about commercialization in the US and some of the needs there as well. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Robert. First we'll come to Duncan.
Tony, thanks very much. A very good afternoon to everybody. My name's Duncan Porter. I'm the General Manager for our sample collection and transport business here at Thermo Fisher. I'm responsible for the global portfolio. Our business is headquartered here in the UK. We actually have, from a Thermo Fisher perspective, 27 sites across the UK, employ over 7,000 people. So we are a pretty major force when it comes to science and research and clinical diagnostics here in the UK. The pandemic, we've all lived through it over the last 18 months, and I really see this as being a catalyst for change in two major ways. Firstly, in terms of collaboration, that linkage between academia, industry, and healthcare providers on the front line has really been forced closer together. And that excites me. It means that we're in a better position going forward as we transition out of the peak of the pandemic, but also that catalyst enables more timely diagnostics through to treatment and new medicine discovery, as well as we look to treat current and future diseases as well. The pandemic here, the UK has played a major part in not only the identification of that virus with the work of the imaging at Oxford University with cryo-EM, but then in terms of vaccine development, vaccine manufacture, and then we've all benefited from the extremely efficient rollout here in the UK. Secondly, the pandemic has highlighted the importance of timely, accurate diagnostics. And historically, I feel that diagnostics have seen as a cost driver within healthcare systems, rather than being positioned as a value driver. And I was inspired to hear your thoughts there, Fiona, when you emphasized the work around AMR and sepsis. A great example is the use of PCT testing, looking at those biomarkers to determine whether we've got a viral or bacterial infection. These patients are often critically ill, and that time to targeted therapy is absolutely critical. But we can go further than simply looking at biomarkers, and new innovations, as you alluded to, Tony, are going to be a key part and enabler with regards to the diagnostics and the advancements within the diagnostics industry. And rapid AST, or rapid antimicrobial susceptibility testing, will enable us to actually move to targeted therapy, utilizing the right antibiotic at the right dosage much faster than we can currently do today. Not only is that going to help with managing AMR overall, it's going to deliver better patient outcomes, shorter length of stay in healthcare facilities, and utilization of drugs in the right way. Robert, you also touched on the importance of commercial innovation. And I think that's going to be an absolute key element of early adoption of new technologies, bringing new solutions, whether they're diagnostics or treatment solutions, is a costly and timely episode. And the procurement of these diagnostic tools needs to change. And I think over time, we'll see a shift much more towards novel procurement methods, looking at outcome-based reimbursement, which will enable very complex cell and molecular diagnostics to be much more widespread and utilized much quicker. So very exciting times. We're on the cusp of moving towards personalized medicine, and diagnostics is right at the core of this.
Thank you, Duncan. And Guy.
Well, thank you for having me back again this year. And I think my hair's a lot shorter this time, like most people. And I guess we, we're now living in this kind of quite far through the pandemic. And I guess we're all a lot more grateful for the NHS this many months later. So thanks again for having me back. Yeah, just to introduce myself. So I'm Guy Hill. I'm the founder of the Trajecture, the dynamic profiling company. And so I set up Trajecture mainly driven by the challenge in translating clinical discoveries through to practice. So a very, very high failure rate of drugs, but it also spoke to the difficulty of developing a diagnostic as well. And so when I set that up, it was very much driven by an overall overarching issue. And it led to us discovering and working on a number of different technologies, all in the omics space mainly. And we actually settled on using multi-time points as a really important lever to understand what's happening in biology better. And so to do that, we're the first company really to take a different way of analyzing time point data. So we now have this method which uses a geometric way of analyzing multi-time point data which opens up a whole suite of different machine learning techniques that just haven't been used before in this sort of data itself. And so we found this amazingly useful, particularly we started working in preclinical studies. We started collaborating with people where they were interested in understanding the mechanism of action on a drug. And then from there, we've worked in the clinical space, particularly helping people to set up challenge trials and baseline trials. So particularly where there's an interest here, understanding really what is going on. In many of these cases, it's such a challenge to predict what's going to come out and understand results if you can't even understand the fundamental biology. And so overlaying techniques such as the things we've been developing, we've found it being an incredible extra advantage. And it's enabled us to now start to think about a future where we're developing a suite of different diagnostic opportunities based on new biomarkers that have been discovered, but again, which are linked to really fundamental disease discoveries, new opportunities for taking an existing medicine and applying it to a new indication or a new disease population, new stratifications, of course, as well, where that's relevant. So there's a whole suite of different things that we're looking at into the future, which is very exciting for us at this time. But I think what you can see is that we're really a science-driven company. And probably the piece that I'm going to just sort of, my link to kind of diagnostics here is I think you'll get a sense that we've worked quite heavily with clinical samples, clinical data, very heavily with omics. And I'm completely biased about the value of using multi-time points. So you'll probably hear that in my answer at some point. And maybe Tony, just if I've got time, just to say a message about, you asked that question about what's changed diagnostics. Gosh, I think it's just been underappreciated massively for the last 15 years. And people have started to realize that, you can't undervalue something which is so fundamentally valuable. And this has come back to the table, and maybe we're seeing in the US, particularly the Silicon Valley model of startups where we can go massive and actually then speak to governments, countries at even a political level, which is required to get these to market now. And so I think I think the investment community is seeing actually a kind of a route to market where previously they just didn't. And I think I say that in kind of a double way, saying I'm really sad actually that it's been underappreciated, but hopeful for the future, which I think is really exciting, and can't wait to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think this discussion for me is timely for a whole host of reasons, given what we've observed and gone through over the last 18 months or so. But I guess if you put yourself not just in the sort of mindset of an infectious disease like COVID-19 and that sort of early detection, across all areas, you put yourself in the position of a patient. The title of the session was "How timely is early detection?" I guess, is early diagnosis always a timely diagnosis if you're the patient? Maybe I'll come to Duncan with that.
Tony, it's a great question. And as I alluded to earlier, the pandemic has been a catalyst for change. And one observation of mine here in the UK is the way in which people are interacting with healthcare systems. And for the first time ever, more than 50% of people are engaging with their GPs in a virtual setting, whether that's via a conference like this or via the telephone. So there needs to be then a shift in the way in which diagnostics plays into that remodeled healthcare system. No longer are the days that when we're not feeling very well, that we take a day off work, we make an appointment with our GP, we go and sit in a waiting room full of sick people, we wait for our appointment, we then go and see the nurse for a blood test, and we wait a few days later for the results to come back. I very much predict a change where we're going to see novel collection devices being sent to our homes. We're very much used now to seeing that as part of the pandemic being part of our own diagnostic journey. Of course, accessioning and the digital ecosystem is going to play an important part in enabling that piece. But then, of course, in terms of timely diagnostics, what is the impact then on treatment pathways that it rolls into? Back in 2013, then the NHS vision around 7-day service. The NHS has been put under such tremendous stress during the pandemic. And I can only thank all of those workers that have been impacted on the front line for what an amazing job they've done. There needs to be a period of decompression now, but also a pivot towards managing the backlog of all of these diseases and people that have not presented early for their diseases, which could mean that those treatment pathways are either different because of their presenting later or are going to have worse outcomes. The other piece then, of course, is when is that diagnosis going to change that treatment pathway itself? And if you've got to wait to the next drug round in the morning, for the example that Fiona gave around sepsis treatment, then a faster diagnostic tool is not going to help in that aspect. We need to look at the delivery of healthcare much more holistically, and not only around these lab-based tests, but taking into account big data capabilities to also unlock lifestyle data and genetic information around those individuals to then move away from the last 100 years of population managed or data-driven pathways to individual personalized medicine. So timely diagnosis is key. The earlier we can provide intervention means that we'll save money on the back end, both from a cost of delivery, but also enabling people to get back to the lives that they love sooner. The shortest path to the best care at the lowest cost.
And I guess part of what prompted my question, I suppose, was if you can diagnose somebody with a condition, but if the health part, the patient pathway and the care pathway isn't set up for that early diagnosis, what do you do then? It probably feels a little less timely if the delivery side, or there isn't a therapeutic or a disease modification. But I don't know, Fiona, how do you see that from a, like, I mean, you work closely with the NHS, you know, and is early detection always better for them?
So certainly in infectious diseases, there's absolutely no doubt that if you could diagnose rapidly, whether it's in ICU next to the patient who's on the ventilator. You know, I've talked to clinicians in ICU and very often they go on gut feel whether to start antibiotic treatment. And that can't be right. You know, does their patient have ventilator associated pneumonia? They can't wait. They have to start treatment. The same's true with sepsis. And I know Thermo Fisher work very closely with Liverpool on the work that we're doing on sepsis. So, you know, absolutely no doubt. And then if we look at the AMR field, you know, what we're moving towards, and it's really interesting, is can we personalize therapy? Can we choose the right antibiotic for that particular patient? And again, that's going to need a rapid turnaround so we can make those decisions fairly quickly, particularly when patients are very seriously ill. But I also actually wanted to take the opportunity, my colleague Steve Smith, who unfortunately doesn't seem to be joining us today, he and I worked together back in the 1990s, and we spun out a women's health company at that time based on his research. And what we were working on was endometriosis. And endometriosis affects 10% of women in the menstrual phase of life. So that's a huge number of women. And even now, today, the time to diagnosis is 18 months to 2 years. We do not have a biomarker-driven test for endometriosis. The only way of diagnosing it with certainty is actually through laparoscopy. I can't speak because of my laryngitis, but anyway, through a laparoscope. So what that does mean is that it's an invasive test. So, you know, my shout out to any of you who are listening today who can look at that area and address this. It's a massive problem worldwide and crying out market need. And why it hasn't been addressed. I mean, I could make unreasonable comments about that, but why it hasn't been addressed so far, I really don't understand. Where here we are over 25 years later and we still don't have a diagnostic test for endometriosis. So, you know, the timely diagnostic, the impact for those women is huge, absolutely huge, because they're going untreated for 18 months to 2 years. So yeah, there's no doubt about it in my mind. And obviously I worked in the oncology field many years ago, but I think some of the other members of this panel can comment much more from a much more informed basis on oncology.
On that front, Robert, maybe I'll come to you, given your oncology.
So I've got sort of two answers
now.
I've got kind of two answers to that question, I guess. So, I mean, the first one is that I see significant structural and logistical barriers, even with tests that one might consider to be fairly routine. So, for example, in the non-small cell lung cancer area, there are barriers in terms of access to tissue samples and occasionally to blood samples as well, that result in physicians effectively putting patients onto platinum chemotherapies before they're actually able to get molecular test results back again. You might say, well, actually, you know, in terms of when the material arrives at a given lab, it should take, you know, 3 to 5 days perhaps for next generation sequencing in order to be able to process that sample. But actually, from a patient perspective, it really, you know, it starts from when they've actually had that biopsy or surgical resection. And in those cases, it can take more like 5 weeks. So you've got a significant period of time there. And there's a pressure that the oncologists feel in order to be able to do something and treat the patient. And then, of course, once you start on a particular treatment course, it's then something that you're not going to necessarily change unless you see a detriment to continuing with that. So you have patients effectively who have, I think, actionable markers and actionable variants that you could use a modern drug on, and there's a drug available for them, but they're still being treated with a sort of general chemotherapy. And there, I think, you know, there are ways to try to reduce that as a problem in terms of allowing pathologists to continue to control access to samples and to allow more of a distributed model in terms of being able to analyze and determine, you know, specifically what variants those patients have. I think then, you know, in oncology, there's a significant, switching this onto my second topic, there's a significant push at the moment for what we would call early detection. So that is detection of cancer in individuals who haven't yet actually even necessarily experienced symptoms or are in the very early stages. And there you have, you know, you have some quite complex molecular diagnostics assays, typically revolving around next generation sequencing, potentially also multi-omics approaches to identify presence or absence of tumor material within usually peripheral blood samples, so-called liquid biopsies. And there, I think, you know, the jury's still out a little bit on exactly how that's going to play out. There's obviously a requirement to have a highly sensitive test in order to be able to detect the majority of patients, but a specificity is also key, because you don't want to be getting into a position where you're starting to do potentially invasive biopsies and investigations of patients who do not have cancer and who have been identified as having cancer by your test and are therefore false positives. So I think those tests have, you know, they obviously have a significant part to play, because detecting these cancers at an earlier time point is very important and certainly gives better treatment or gives better outcomes for those patients. It's also typically the most difficult point in which to detect the cancer, because at that point the amount of tumor DNA in the bloodstream is lower than it is in later stage cancers, which obviously adds a layer of technical difficulty. But in terms of how this plays out actually in the healthcare system, I think, you know, we will have to wait and see, and whether or not it segments and stratifies into, you know, specific at-risk populations, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, and Guy, I guess, just following on from that, you know, you sort of touched upon in the introductory part about the use of data sets and the abilities now to repurpose drugs into earlier diagnosed and more accurately diagnosed precision medicine, which I guess follows on from where Robert's coming from, I guess, is, do you think the world is now ready for more to really deliver on precision medicine? I think we've made huge progress without that. Can you take it further?
It's an amazingly big topic that I'll try and do justice to. I mean, I think it is. I think there's obviously a number of challenges in terms of the implementation of that. And I think it's come up several times through Fiona, various who have been saying about the challenges of implementation through the NHS. I think, in terms of, I'm just maybe start with the US model of healthcare, where I think, if we look at the availability of diagnostics, I think it's more of a fair reflection on return on investment calculations rather than necessarily other structural challenges. And I think in those cases, I think certainly from a diagnostic point of view, in terms of triaging patients towards just say a more precise treatment, I think that is flowing. I think that is moving in the right direction. I think if you're talking about precision medicines as in terms of precision use of pharmaceuticals, I think there's a structural issue there in the pharma sector still. I think you will hear time and time again from people where there's an amazing amount of technology and the ability to do things in a precise way, but fundamentally through the whole of the pharma system, we are penalized for asking questions and finding out information. And you will find companies and you will find individuals, you'll find many individuals who are absolutely passionate about doing things right and they're completely science-led. But at some point, there becomes decisions that are taken from a commercial basis, and it still, I think, is a huge hamper. I can't tell you how many times I hear this in terms of, are you better off applying your profiling technologies to looking at, say, adverse events, which is potentially a blocker on developing a medicine, or identifying a response population? There isn't a commercial driver often for the response population. That still hasn't been solved from a structural point of view. And I think until that does, we'll probably still be having the same conversation, actually, unfortunately, in a few years' time. I guess I'm probably come full circle, though, just the importance of diagnostics. And I think that was one of the questions I think you sort of said us a bit was about the early and timely nature of diagnostics. And my thought is just there's no way we can ever say you can be too early with a diagnosis. And it's only that there's a case that you might say is not a good return on investment of having that diagnosis because of availability of treatment. But then that is, that argument, particularly if you're in a public healthcare system, is a real fallacy, because it's only by having those early diagnoses will treatments come in. I mean, I think you might look at cholesterol as a surrogate for heart disease. I mean, if that link hadn't been really firmly established over the years, I don't think you'd find a whole suite of medicines. GPs wouldn't do routine cholesterol tests and wouldn't have difficult conversations with patients about their diet and health. So I would just be a huge advocate for proper centralized investment in diagnostics, not just a piecemeal bit in terms of the NHS, but I really hope the last year has convinced people about going along the model that Fiona was discussing about centralizing diagnostics, but at a national level. I really can't see why, of a country so small as Britain, we don't have a centralized diagnostic service with actually, it will sound like an enormous budget, and it will be, but that will be an immediate UK market for diagnostics. And I'll probably go one step further as well, if you may. If you centralize this, you have the ability to track people over time. And I really think that's going to be the future of health monitoring and really catching some of these things, particularly the most challenging, like neurodegenerative diseases. I can really foresee something where there's going to be a research paper coming out that says we can now monitor and we can understand who has Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease. We just need to have 5 to 10 years worth of blood samples from them. And now then the clock will start ticking for us. Yeah.
And I think that's sorry, Duncan. Yeah,
I'd love to respond to Guy's comments there. I think they're fascinating. I fully agree with the comments both of Guy and Robert. Really, I think at the moment we see diagnostics when people are ill, rather than actually utilizing diagnostics up front as an enabler towards preventative health measures. If we were already being able to look at the genotypes of individuals, that by gene sequencing we'll be able to tell you that you're already at a proposition to certain illnesses that come forward in your life, that would enable you to make lifestyle choices in order to better manage the likelihood of that. You touched on the element of biomarkers with HbA1c with regards to a prerequisite to diabetes. These elements should already be coming through to actually enable people to make the right lifestyle choices, giving people the information earlier and treating them holistically rather than they presenting with a condition later, which then is far more costly coming back. To Robert's point as well around some of the barriers of managing molecular testing widespread, particularly from a cancer perspective on biopsies or liquid biopsies. It's really important to enable technology to be accessible and easy to use. The 4 or 5 days a week length of time that you referenced there, Robert, has got to change. With the launch of the Genexus platform, then we're able to do that within 1 day. And any lab technician that can pipette a sample can then operate that platform. That allows the scientists that are at the forefront of research to be freed up and allow them to progress the progress in these areas much further, reducing cost ultimately to make those technologies and levels of diagnosis available to as many people as possible. But great comments. I really enjoyed those 2 points you made. Thank you.
And I think for me, it was someone far more wise than myself a few years back when I was presenting and extolling the virtues of various forms of omics and UK strengths in them. And this chap said, well, the only omics that matters is economics. And selling is hard. And creating the value proposition to say intervene early and spend and invest in this as a structure, rather than kick it down the road and it's somebody else's budget problem if you're not still in the role, is a difficult value proposition to sell. But Fiona, part of being able to sell that is going to be key to bringing in investment, because they're going to want to see a route to market. So how do you go about that from an early stage diagnostics perspective, or diagnostic company and technology? How do you package that to investors?
Well, I guess it's like everything else. I mean, investors will look at every small or large investment opportunity on its own merits. And I think, if we go back over recent years, we've seen some enormous successes. And again, it's not my current area of expertise, but in the oncology field, the advent of companion diagnostics in order to select the right treatment for the patient. DXS was an enormous UK success in terms of, being founded by one of my ex-Celtic Tech colleagues, Steve Little, and going on to an amazing exit and also, more important, I think, benefit to patients. So it's definitely proven HER2 in oncology. It's definitely proven that companion diagnostics are there and will help us. And I think that's where we're trying to get to with many other areas, including, as I've said already, part of the antimicrobial resistance agenda is, how do we spare our antibiotics? How do we implement good stewardship? And that really, certainly at the research level, is moving towards, how do you select the right antibiotic for the right patient? And that's going to be about, what are the biomarkers? What are the diagnostic tests? We're going to need point of care tests. They're going to need to be cheap. And I think the other thing we need to think about as well with all of these tests is global accessibility. So it's not good enough to just develop diagnostics for the developed world. We have to take into account the fact that low-income and middle-income countries also have a crying need for diagnostics to be available. So how can we develop these platforms so that not only are they cheap to run, but they can run in the environment that you're going to face in a low-income country, which means they may not need to be dependent on having electricity supply. And it may be that you have to allow for temperature.
We may have lost Fiona there, Bruton. Just while we're waiting for Fiona to come back, maybe Robert, you've sort of gone a bit down this track as well in terms of commercialization and how to gain the investment to commercialize. How does that look in the US? You know, we've got the NHS, and it's such a huge asset for us to say if we can get that working, it's a great springboard for that. How does it look in the US for your convincing different sorts of payers?
So in terms of the US healthcare market, surprisingly fragmented actually in many respects. So yeah, it never ceases to amaze me when we discuss this with our Chief Commercial Officer, Steve Miller, in terms of, you know, how to gain access to reimbursement. It's an incredibly complicated topic, which would take a long time for us to go through today, actually. But I mean, you know, there's certainly interesting discussions to be had as well around regulatory barriers, I think, here too, particularly, you know, in the EU with the IVDR, and UK's perhaps viewpoint on this going forward now after Brexit versus, you know, the US with their LDT model, and potential challenges to that as well in terms of the Valid Act coming forward. So, you know, as always in our industry, it's highly regulated and for good reason, but that does represent challenges, and it can be a high burden, particularly for small companies.
And I'm delighted we have Fiona back. Sort of fell off the virtual stage there for a moment.
Sorry, did I go mid-sentence? I lost my internet connection.
It happens, you know. But I guess we were just sort of developing our theme through about the whole sort of regulatory, and certainly given the changes in regulatory now going on in Europe, what the UK looks like. But I'm just sort of wondering, I'm conscious of, we could talk about lots of this for so all day, really, lots of different avenues. But I wanted to come back to Guy's sort of centralized model and yours, Fiona, to some degree. And I don't know which one of you would maybe like to take this one first. Where does standardization come in? Is that where we need the centralization? Because we had lots of discussions going on around whether lateral flow tests in COVID-19, were they working, were they valid? And communicating levels of risk or probability of being right was clearly a major challenge when you're dealing with, you know, a very diverse population. But I don't know whether one of you would like to, how do you feel standardization works, I guess, but it's huge amounts of data sets as well as distributed testing.
I would certainly say that for the NHS, and I was on a conference yesterday where this topic came up as well, which is the comment was that there are too many platforms. So you can't expect any lab, and particularly an NHS lab, to kit itself out with different platforms for different tests. Now, this might not be music to the ears of some of the companies that, you know, have a substantial market share, but we need to have we need to have standardization of platforms so that as these new tests come along, that you don't need to spend another 100,000 on a new piece of equipment. So you know, you can imagine that in a big NHS lab, and I know during COVID, you know, we at Alderhay, we've been very dependent on having certain diagnostic equipment donated to us so that we can carry on testing our staff, you know, and that's just obviously a COVID related issue, but for a centralized lab, and I don't really know how you bring this about, but somehow we have to have it so that whatever the diagnostic test, there are a limited number of platforms on which they'll run. And I think we'll get far more adoption into the NHS if we could have a mindset. And I think it comes back to Duncan's point, which is this is about industry collaborating and possibly collaborating with the NHS to say, how do we make this happen?
And Guy, I guess, as well as the technology platforms, it's the data sets as well. How interoperable are those data sets that come through, and how do you standardize them?
Tony, I'm going to disappoint you a little bit by taking it back one step, in the sense of saying that once you start getting to data integration point, particularly where you get multi-center studies, it's often the case that the underlying challenge is one of sample handling prep. And so you can reveal it necessarily at the data handling stage, and you see this classic thing of doing component analysis, principal component analysis, and you see, okay, well, the dominant feature is that this was done on a Wednesday, this is on a Thursday, or this was done in this lab, this was done in the other lab. But it doesn't help you get back there. So that, to me, it really just speaks to this, the core principle about the importance of standardization of the sample prep handling, etc. I think it, you can see that this comes about to some extent through it's even just the scientist approach versus the commercial rigor. That in labs we're not necessarily taught to measure pH at the same right temperature. I know it's tiny things like that, but the attention to detail is just so immense. It's required, and so that's why I believe in a centralized model where possible. I mean, I think there's also a distinction. I think I was just going to pick up on the point that Fiona was mentioning about the platform standardization, which I think is a really, really fair one. That it might be that we have to think about platforms which are good for discovery, but just are way too expensive for implementation, and we need to then think about translating things which are seen as robust in themselves in terms of results into platforms which are much cheaper and much easier to have in different parts of the world. I may not have fully answered your question, Tony.
No, I think that's
because I did want to say how important I see sample prep and the
yeah, and I think that's the bit, the sort of standardization. The data's only can be as good as the data we're putting in consistently.
But I think it's also that I think it could be I think it's a sad result if we say we've got these amazing platform technologies which are so sensitive. So I'm thinking about, we use a lot of transcriptomics. We can pick up a patient who's doing heavy exercise when they shouldn't have been. I mean, they're incredibly powerful techniques, but it's created a problem in standardizing our sample prep. But that's okay. That's okay. It's good that we've got such powerful techniques. Now let's figure out the automation and sample prep handling.
Indeed, which I guess leans me towards Duncan really on the panel as one of those dominant players in the space of how you standardize these platforms.
Yeah, I think Fiona and Guy, they've hit the nail on the head with a lot of these pieces already. Historically, many of those steps that we talked about in terms of sample prep, extraction, and then next-gen sequencing, you are introducing variables, and you want to minimize those levels of variable standardization as much as possible. So those advanced platforms that are actually fully automated, that actually do the sample prep for you, do the extraction for you, that you only have a single point of putting in that sample is exactly what you want to get to. I'm excited about the UK though, and you touched on the importance of data as well. And I think the work that the Catapult Centre is doing, particularly looking at gene and therapy, cell therapy research, etc. These elements of bringing data together. There's huge amounts of data in the NHS already, and Fiona will know the work of her teams and people there. They're burdened by a lot of data collection, and to put in place additional tools to collect data, I don't think is the answer. I think we can be much smarter in utilizing the data that is there, mining that data, bringing it back together, utilizing platforms like NHS Digital to actually be the core driver around the evidence that's needed, that's much more holistic than simply looking at one diagnostic test, but taking a much more broader view of that individual person. I go full circle with regards to my opening comments about that pathway towards personalized medicine, precision diagnostics. It comes much more about looking at the holistic well-being rather than the single point of data for that individual. And we're right on the cusp of it. And by utilizing the clinical data that's in the NHS, overlaying that with other sources of information that's available into that NHS digital platform, it is going to be a key enabler for evidence-based practice at a personalized level.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. And Robert, I wanted to come to you on a final point, really. I guess time always flies. But there are some disease areas, whether it's infectious diseases and and we've seen that recently with oncology as well, has always been seen as a kind of a leading disease area in terms of biomarkers and early diagnosis in liquid biopsy. Are there lessons from those sort of pioneering therapy areas and treatment areas that other areas could learn in things like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's?
I think so. So I think there's some really good examples, and I think Guy and Duncan have already alluded to many of them, where you have diagnostics that have gone hand in hand, or development of diagnostics has gone hand in hand with drug development. So HIV/AIDS would be a classic example there, in terms of being able to develop assays to understand viral titer, to understand drug resistance mutations, and to be able to quantitate those in patients, along with the development of novel therapeutics. And I think that there's a real opportunity with current technologies in oncology to be able to do the same thing. So instead of having to wait, a period of 1 to 3 to 5 years for follow-up, we would be able to use some of the molecular and diagnostic tools that we have available to us to be able to really understand whether any given treatment therapy is working for that individual. And then also to begin to start to tailor treatments going forward to individuals as they begin to emerge, potentially have resistance mutations that emerge over time. So I think there's the potential here to kind of short circuit some of that development time by using these technologies hand in hand.
And just as you're talking, it sort of occurred to me that if we really crack early detection across a multitude of different areas, and there's a centralized facility to do this, if you wave that magic wand, will then the ability to diagnose early, will it start to shape the types and particular therapeutic agents that we start developing?
So I think there's a continuum here. I mean, early detection assays in oncology are really about detection of tumor DNA amongst a plethora of healthy DNA effectively. So that same technology effectively can be applied at any point in the treatment paradigm. So you could be monitoring a patient who is undergoing chemotherapy. You could monitor a patient who has undergone surgery, and you can actually make a real-time treatment decision based on the molecular profile of a peripheral blood sample or a liquid biopsy. So I think there's a lot of work to do there around what is the best intervention and at what time, but it's exciting. And it certainly leads to a different way, I think, of treating patients going forward.
Yeah. Duncan, I was just sort of mindful in terms of that critical mass of platform technology that Thermo can bring, and the experience of collaborating now. You touched on it right at the start, and I think it's probably quite a nice way to round it out. Is that difference in collaboration between NHS, industry, academia, and the public to some degree, because people have come forward like never before to get trials done and to adopt testing. Do you think the experience of the pandemic has moved the needle towards early detection becoming routine?
Absolutely, without question. I think it's put diagnostics right at the forefront of population health management. I think it's also changed expectations of the population on how they utilize diagnostics. Whilst there's still a lot of work to do around education, because I think overall, if you have a diagnostic test, as a whole, people don't know the difference between the performance of those individual tests, but particularly for patients who have a heavily invested element within their care pathway. Robert just used the examples of cancer patients, particularly in remission, to monitor the progress of these cancer markers, etc., really is key to long-term health. I'm conscious of time, Tony, and we need to wrap things up. I think
time always flies when you're having fun, and but I'd just like to thank our panelists for sharing your insights for me, who's sort of new to looking at the IVD field ahead of this panel, and I've learned a lot from you, a lot to think about. We've got NHS systems under pressure and they're busy, so where do we enable and invest in those systems and capacities to allow the change? because there's certainly a momentum, there's certainly loads of innovation and ideas and potential. So for me, it's a big thank you to you as our panel for sharing those insights. It's been my pleasure to host you. And for everyone else, we're going to take a short break for 5 minutes before we move to the final panel of the live streaming. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Tony.
Bye-bye.